A great summer picture for this one. A lot of nice watered down colors, softened colors with a lot of water. Your picture, you want to sketch out as much of your picture as you can. It's really not necessary to sketch a lot of the details right now because you can sketch them on after the fact. But you want to make sure that you misket the little shovel and your flowers. We're going to use a big flat brush today. We're going to be using our rigger and our fine liner. We're also going to be using a number. I used a number 6, but you could use a number 4 if you're comfortable with that. You're going to definitely use your misket. You're going to be using salt, and you're going to be using your sponge. Colors, we're going to be using mostly lighter colors, so you're going to use your cerulean blue. You'll use some ultramarine blue, although if you have other favorite blues that you'd like to use, you can use those also. We're going to be using burnt umber, very watered down most of the time. We'll be using a little bit of burnt sienna in our wood. We're also going to be using black, and we will be using our cadmium yellow, just a little touch here and there into the sand, and our sap green. We're beginning with the sky, so we're going to be putting down some water over the sky area so that my blues can blend together and I'll have a lot of nice soft edges. No hard edges on this sky because this is a cloudless sky, so I want everything to be super smooth, super blended. You can go over anything that's in your sky area because anything that's in the sky area is darker than the blue that we're going to be putting down. We'll put on a nice wash of cerulean blue mixed with a little bit of ultramarine. And then once that is down, we'll put another wash of the ultramarine along the top of the sky to just deepen the top of the paper. But a lot of nice, great color. I'm keeping some of the color from the horizon line just so I can allow it to blend down to the horizon line and soften. And then, of course, as it softens, it will get lighter in tone. I'm going to move that paper around in all directions, on its side, upside down, straight up and down, so that that paint flows through the water in all directions. It'll soften all the edges, give you some great soft edges, and it'll even itself out so you'll have a perfectly even sky. The sand area is going to be next, and that is a really watered down burnt umber. I mean, looking like more like dirty water than actual paint because you want it to be nice and light in color because this is going to be the first of a couple different washes. So the only thing I left not painted was my boats in the far right because some of them had white on them, but everything else can get painted over again because everything is going to be darker than this really pale umber. This is very, very pale. A lot of water and just a little bit of your coloring. paint that over everything. We're not salting or anything yet. We are simply putting the coloring on, but while it's wet, I'm going to add a little touch of black to that umber, and along my line where the water is coming in to meet the sand, I'm going to deepen that while it's wet so that it can have a soft blend to it. I'm also going to use that same coloring later on for some of my pathways. Now we're going to dry brush all of the wood in the picture, and I'm using just some watered down black. Dab your brush off so that it's not too wet, and you want to dry brush with that black on all of the wood so that the wood is going to look very weathered. The water is going to be next, and I'm going to be using that same color I used for the sky, but adding a little bit more of ultramarine to it to make it a little bit darker. I'm dry brushing the edge of the water closest to the sand, and then I'll paint it in solid as I get closer to the horizon line. I'm also going to add a line of ultramarine to the horizon line water while it's still wet, just to deepen it slightly, and then I'm going to throw on some salt. I'm using my watered down black, and I am putting in some darkness to the sand where the water is rushing in to make that sand look wet and darker versus the sand that is in the foreground. It's slightly darker, dry brushing a lot of it, and then salting it. It's not really too much of a solid line other than the very closest line closest to the water's edge, but otherwise it's just kind of dry brushed and then salted. I'm adding some extra color in that would be on that mound of sand where my weeds are going to come from, just to separate it from the rest of the sand. And behind that wooded fence area, and I'm salting that. That way that'll be done. I won't have to try to shadow and make it darker once all of my grasses are in. Now I'm going to be using my sponge and that same little bit of watered down black to kind of flop my sponge around in the sand in the foreground to make it look like a lot of footsteps in that sand. Rather than painting them in with my brush, the sponge does a nice job of doing those footprints that are really soft, not real dense in color, but it'll give the impression that the sand is very walked on. Now we're going to be using watered down sap, just straight sap, and you're going to put a wash on where all of that foreground foliage is. You want to use your brush to dry brush the top of it off so that it looks all uneven, and this is just a straight wash. Once it's dry, I am putting on some additional misket where some of my taller grasses are behind that wooden fence. Not the tall ones on the mound, but the tall ones that are going to be through some additional green. If you don't want to do this, it's not necessary, but I just did it so that I could get a change of my green colors. Now while your biscuit is drying, you can go ahead and start to paint in some of your detail things. Your boats, the lines on your boats in the background. You can paint in your wood with a straight wash now of burnt umber or burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black, depending on what coloring you want in your wood. You just want to go ahead and paint it straight. You don't have to paint it section by section, because once we start with our shadowing, that will separate out the pieces of wood. So I just used some straight burnt umber, painted in most of my wood. The wood in the fence area in the foreground, I did paint with a little bit of a watered down color so it wasn't quite as dark. Now, if you didn't already paint in the green mound behind that fenced part, you can go ahead and paint that in now. If you already painted it in, that's fine also, because we're going to be sponging in over this initial wash of green just to give it some depth and to save us a lot of time versus painting in individual leaves. We are going to draw in some individual leaves and paint them separately, or paint around the green to pop them out, but not all the leaves. We're just going to pick out some sections and paint those in. But you can go ahead and paint this section in behind that wooded fence area if you didn't already do so, sponging it in. So we're going to be sponging in with a much darker green, so I mixed my sap with some black, and I'm going to be sponging in that foreground, over that foreground green. Remember, hold your sponge lightly, don't press hard, so that you get little sections of sponging, not big pressed sections of the darker paint. You want this to be few and far between. The areas that are not going to be painted in, we are going to be sketching in some leaves and then painting around them to pop them out because they will be light green. And once we paint around them, you'll just soften the color with a wet brush. Now this drawing and painting does not have to all be done at the same time. It doesn't matter if you create a hard line because this is all foliage, so it'll just work into the fact that there are grasses and stems and leaves, and it doesn't really matter. So you don't have to try to hurry and finish this all at the same time. Once you do finish that though, then we're going to move to that mound of high grass. You want to start by dry brushing along the edge of that mound of sand. You're going to dry brush with the same coloring, some sap mixed with some black, and you're going to dry brush all along that edge to create your base, and then you'll be using a rigger and a fine liner to pull out your grasses. Remember that your rigger or your fine liner only holds a very small amount of paint. So you need to continue to dip into your paint supply to get a nice smooth line. If you don't put enough paint on your brush, you'll get a broken line of grass because your paintbrush can only hold so much water and paint. It also needs to be painted slowly. your grasses need to be painted slowly. If you try to move the brush too fast, again, you are going to get a broken line because you're not giving that paint time enough to get off the brush onto the paper. Continue to move all the way across your mound of sand, dry brushing and painting the grasses as you go. I would suggest doing that all in one step so that you don't allow for all of the short dry brush strokes to dry before you start to paint in your grasses. So do it a little bit at a time, but kind of complete it as you go. Make sure you get enough grass. You don't want just a few pieces of grass. You want it to look like full sections. You can change the color from your sap to your umber. You can change your colors a little bit. You can even add some indigo. And you want to make your grasses go in more than one direction, meaning not all of the grasses are just straight up and down. Some go off to the side. After my grasses are done and completely dry, I'm going to go ahead and add some more sections to my sand just by putting in some watered down horizontal lines of watered down black. You can mix it with a little bit of umber, soften the edge with water, and throw some salt on it. You're making it look like the sand in some areas is wet, so darker in color. You want to dry brush off the edges or soften it with water, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. Then you're going to start to do your shadowing along the sides of the wood. The parts of the wood that are not getting the total sunlight, you're just going to shadow with some watered down black. That would be the sides to the board, the overhangs to the boards that sit back in. All of those would need shadowed, and you can simply follow your picture for that shadowing. Now you want to complete all your little detail work, all of your grasses, your chairs, your bench, your boats, anything like that, before you add your flags to the tops of some of your taller grasses. To do that, you're just going to use your rigger. You're going to lay it on its side at the top of the grass and just dry brush it quickly towards you. If you want to do a couple practice ones on the back of your paper, you can, but they are just simple, quick dry brush strokes that will pull out some of that grassy look to the flag at the top of the grass. And then you can paint in a couple little pieces also. Don't overdo and don't make it too big. These are not gigantic tops to the grasses. They are very frilly, very fragile. So you want to make them with just a few simple strokes. Not every piece of grass has to have a flag top, so plan it accordingly. Don't do it all in one section, but don't have them spaced exact either. So kind of decide where you want to have them, some high, some low, and add accordingly. Fewer is better. You can always add, but it's certainly not a good idea to try to take off. Once all of your flags are done, then you're going to go ahead and take off your misketing. Your misketing is on your shovel and all of your flowers, so you'll remove all of that. Your shovel, of course, you can paint any color that you want. I used a turquoise color for my shovel and a light yellow ochre handle. And your flowers are yellow, cad yellow, with a black or a dark umber center. Make sure that you have shadows under your benches, under your chairs, under your boat sitting on the sand, under that wooden fence area. Make sure all of that has a shadow. I even put some shadowing behind my shovel going back towards the wooden fence post. So you want to make sure all of the things that need shadowed are shadowed. That will add to your picture. Once everything is painted in, then lastly you can add your real fine lines to your boat masts. I used my real fine liner for that. If you're not comfortable with that, you can use a watercolor pencil, but you do want to make sure that they are nice and straight. The white poles, I put a shadow on the back of those white poles. Any little flags that you have on your masts, you can paint those in. Do all of your little detail work. If your grasses still look like they need to be thickened up a little bit, you can always add to them. Add a couple grasses, add more than a couple, add where you need it to make it look nice and full. Once you are finished, then you can go ahead and sit back, relax, look at that painting, and wish you were there. Happy painting. Enjoy your summer.